Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second installment in the Biodiversity Caucus's webinar series. I do want to start things off by acknowledging that this virtual event is being hosted in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1725, and these treaties did not deal with the surrender of land, but they did set out the rights and responsibilities that settlers and Mi'kmaq people owe to one another. So as such, we are all treaty people. My name is Cass, and I got involved with the Biodiversity Caucus through my role as network coordinator with the Nova Scotia Environmental Network. So if you're unfamiliar with NSEN, we are a network of about 45 environmental organizations across the province whose common purpose is to conserve and enhance the natural environment and build a sustainable future for Nova Scotia. So as an environmental network, we strive to support, strengthen, and promote the work of our members by connecting them to each other, to government, and to the public. So a little bit about the Biodiversity Caucus. This webinar series is an initiative brought to you by the Caucus. And if you aren't familiar with the Caucus, it is simply a recurring series of meetings between those who share a common environmental priority. So in this case, biodiversity. One of the most effective ways for NSEN to connect members of the environmental community is through the formation of environmental caucuses like this one. Caucus members join monthly meetings with those working in, volunteering in, or interested in issues related to biodiversity. At a caucus meeting, you can expect to network and learn about current and upcoming biodiversity-related projects, programs, and events from across the province. So the main purpose of these meetings really is just to promote collaboration and advance biodiversity work in Nova Scotia. Anyone who's passionate about protecting biodiversity can join the caucus. So whether you are an NGO representative, an academic, or an individual eager to make a difference, you are welcome to participate in the group. If you would like to chat more about the caucus, please feel free to reach out to me anytime at biodiversity@nsenvironmentalnetwork.com. I'll pop that in the chat in a second as well. And if you're already convinced, you can complete our short interest form using the link that I will also enter into the chat. So now I'm very happy to welcome our guest speaker, Hannah Delow, who is the Terrestrial Ecological Monitoring Lead with ACAP Cape Breton. Hannah loves bees, trees, and a good cup of tea. With a strong passion for research and environmental literacy, Hannah loves connecting with and learning from nature, using her skill sets to enhance ecological health and involve community members in environmental conservation. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Hannah.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and then I'll pass it over to my colleague, Megan, who's going to do a little bit of an introduction about ACAP before we jump into all of the pollinating insect stuff. Okay. How does that look, Megan? That look good?
Looks good.
Great.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're really excited to share one of our projects that we have on the go at ACAP with you tonight. My name is Megan. Like Hannah said, I'll be doing a quick introduction of ACAP, and then I'll pass it back over to her, and she'll talk about the pollinator work she's leading on safeguarding pollinators in Cape Breton, Unama'ki. Also, like Cass already mentioned, we'll have some time at the end of the presentation for questions. So if you think of anything throughout the presentation, you can send your question in the chat and we'll be sure to answer it at the end. As settlers, Hannah and I want to acknowledge that we work and live in Unama'ki, the unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq people. At ACAP, we spend a lot of our time working on the land of Unama'ki. We value the knowledge and teachings that we've had the privilege of learning from the Mi'kmaq community, and we aspire to keep an open space for cultural teachings and experiences. We're excited to learn, grow, and continue to support the stewardship of the land for future generations. So to introduce ACAP, we're a nonprofit environmental organization. Our three core areas of work are ecological monitoring, which involves projects such as the pollinator work we'll talk about today, habitat restoration within streams and forests, and environmental education, which involves working closely within schools and the community. So our ecological monitoring team is broken into two main branches, with myself leading our coastal and aquatic projects and Hannah leading our terrestrial projects, with, of course, a lot of overlap in between. We get to do lots of fun and interesting work like monitoring frogs, coastal wetlands, and the main reason we're here today, pollinators. So without further ado, I'll hand it back over to Hannah and we can talk pollinators.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. Hi, everyone. So yeah, my name is Hannah, and I'm ACAP's Pollinator Monitoring and Research Program Manager. So I thought I'd start today's presentation a little bit by sharing a little bit of background information about me. So I've been working with pollinators since 2020 when I started my undergraduate honors thesis on bumblebees with Dr. David McCorkadale at Cape Breton University. And I remember some of the first field days that summer. It was the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it was really challenging to do any sort of research at the time. And being in the field on those bright summer days, surrounded by meadows, buzzing with bumblebees, that just lit something up for me. And I knew that working with pollinators was important and that it was something that I wanted to continue to do throughout my career. So flash forward to 4 years later, I'm really excited to be heading back to my roots, working with bees and other pollinators with ACAP and many other wonderful research partners. So before we dive into the presentation, I wanted to give a quick overview of what I'll be chatting about. So first, I'm going to share some background information about pollinators. Then I'm going to review some of the pollinator conservation projects that ACAP and several other local organizations are working on. And then lastly, I'm going to share some information about the work ACAP is doing to generate more awareness about pollinators and the important role that they play on our farms and in our communities. So let's start by talking about why pollinators are so important. So as the name suggests, pollinators pollinate. So this means that when they move from one flower to the next, they help transfer pollen between plants. Many species of bees do this little dance or they buzz around when they land on a flower, and this movement helps release pollen and communicate to other bees around that there's food available there. Pollination allows plants to produce fruit and seeds. And when we think about wild plants, this means that pollinators support biodiversity. So all of the beautiful wildflower meadows and wetland plants that we see today exist thanks to pollinators. So for example, in Nova Scotia, we're really well known for our wild blueberries, which completely rely on bees and other pollinating insects to produce fruit. Blueberries aren't the only thing that pollinators pollinate, of course. The Pollinator Partnership Canada says that about 1 in every 3 bites of the food that we eat is actually because of pollinators. So in many ways, these small but mighty creatures are essential for life on Earth as we know it. So when you think about pollinators, you're probably thinking of beautiful butterflies, maybe some hummingbirds, and cute little bees, all of those charismatic pollinators. However, there are so many other species that help pollinate crops and wild plant species. Believe it or not, flies and wasps are actually some top-tier pollinators, and many bats and beetles are pollinators as well. Like many other species, some species of pollinators are at risk or endangered, and that could have significant impacts on food security and biodiversity, not just in Nova Scotia, but all around the world. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm mostly going to be talking about pollinating insects such as butterflies and bumblebees. So you might be thinking though, what about honeybees? Where exactly do they fit into this conversation? Well, honeybees are widely thought to be one of the most valuable pollinators, and they're often brought onto farms for their economic value and their pollinator prowess. But what would I tell you if the honeybees are not quite the queen bee that you thought they were? Well, naturally, when people think about protecting pollinators, they often think of saving honeybees. And in reality, they're not actually the bees that need saving. Honeybees are not native to North America, and they're not at risk of extinction. And in fact, most honeybees in Canada are used as managed livestock, like cows or chickens, and they're safeguarded by farmers and beekeepers. So if honeybees are not properly managed, they can actually harm wild native bee populations by spreading diseases. So it's something we have to be really careful about. Although honeybees do pollinate crops, their main focus is producing that sweet honey. So who reigns queen bee when it comes to pollination? Well, wild native bees, of course. Wild native bees are much more efficient pollinators. They can pollinate for longer, and they can often just stay in one area and pollinate everything in sight before they move on to another area. So due to the length of their proboscis or their tongue, bumblebees, for example, can feed on a variety of different flowers much more easily than a honeybee can. So how can you tell a bumblebee from a honeybee? Well, bumblebees, like this tricolored bumblebee on the left here, they're much larger and they're furrier than honeybees. So this fuzz on their body helps them stay warm, which allows them to buzz around in the early morning and in the late evening when it's too cool for honeybees to be out pollinating. So their thorax, so this top part here by their head, and their abdomen, they're much more rounded, as you can see, and the coloring and the size of bumblebees can vary between species. So in Cape Breton, for example, we have over 13 different species of bumblebees. And honeybees, like this little one on the right here, they're much smaller and slimmer overall than a bumblebee. So they have a more definable wasp voice, which is kind of this little cinched in spot here between the abdomen and the thorax. And there's only one species of honeybee that we're going to find locally, and that is the Western honeybee, which is native to Europe and not native to Canada or anywhere in North America. So besides honeybees, one of the greatest threats to pollinators is, of course, climate change. Many pollinators are deeply affected by climate change. Insects rely on cues from nature to know when to emerge in spring, and climate change has made these natural cues unreliable. So we have unexpected late frosts, a lot more storms. These videos were taken within days of each other during Hurricane Fiona. So even though sunflowers are not a native wildflower, this still gives us an idea of how pollinators' food sources can be affected by climate change. Other threats to pollinators include habitat loss due to human development and industrial agriculture. We can accidentally create concrete monoculture deserts for pollinators, which can make it really challenging for insects to access different types of food. And then another thing is pesticide usage, which can also be really harmful for pollinators, especially if pesticides are being sprayed on crops that are blooming, because that's when pollinators are going to be out and about visiting those flowers. So these threats have put many species of pollinators at risk. And in Cape Breton, we have several at-risk and endangered pollinating insects. But these are kind of the big three charismatic pollinators that we hear talked about the most often. So first we have the yellow-banded bumblebee, then we have the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee, and monarchs, of course. So like most bumblebees, the yellow-banded bumblebee, or Bombus terricola, is a ground or cavity nester. So instead of the traditionally depicted hives that are associated with honeybees, this little gal, she's going to often be found, in the dirt, honestly, or in a little, log or a hole in a tree somewhere. And these are really easily identified by their distinctive black and yellow stripes across their body. Bumblebees in general are eusocial, which means that they live in a colony that is led by a single queen. So this queen lays all of the eggs, and the female worker bees help care for the young and collect the pollen and the nectar to help feed the colony. So when you see a bee, the majority of the time you can actually assume that that bee is female. So queen bees start emerging in the spring around this time of year, kind of more like around May. And they're much larger. So that's why bees this time of year seem a lot bigger than the ones that you see in the summer. In the spring, the queens seek out nesting spots so that they can lay their eggs. And then once hatched, the worker bees head out into the world to gather pollen and nectar to bring back to the colony. You can see them, during the summer, mainly from July all the way up until September. So in the late summer, early fall, the queens then produce males to mate with the next generation of queens. And then the new queens burrowed under a pile of leaves or in the dirt, and then they overwinter there, and then the cycle begins anew the following spring. So our next species at risk is the endangered gypsy cuckoo bumblebee. So this bumblebee can vary in appearance, but for the most part, they have this band of yellow on the thorax, right, kind of near their head, essentially. And then most of their body is black, except for the last segment of the abdomen, essentially their bee butt. And that's a light yellowish white color. So the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee is a little bit different than most bumblebees. So this particular bee is a parasite of the yellow-banded bumblebee. Now, parasitism might sound like a bad thing, but all that means for bumblebees is that a gypsy cuckoo bumblebee will lay her eggs in the nest of a queen yellow-banded bumblebee. So that yellow-banded bumblebee is going to care for and raise her young alongside her own. The gypsy cuckoo bumblebee relies on this yellow-banded bumblebee to rear her young. So because the yellow-banded bumblebee is at risk, the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee is even more at risk. And in fact, we have not seen this bumblebee in Cape Breton in over 20 years. The yellow-banded bumblebee population is on the rise, so we might see them yet, and that's the hope. Now, I'm sure you've heard of our third pollinator here, as monarchs are known around the world as globetrotters for the massive migration that they undertake every year when they head from Canada to the northern, from Canada and the northern United States to Mexico every fall. Adult monarchs are easily identified for their vibrant orange coloring. So they have this kind of a black border around their wings, and it's speckled with these little white polka dots. And that's a pretty easy way to differentiate it between other butterflies. So monarchs arrive in Cape Breton in late spring, early summer. And the adult butterflies will lay their eggs on milkweed plants. Like you can see this swamp milkweed here in the bottom. And that is what their larvae or caterpillars up here in the top, that's what they eat. So milkweed is quite toxic, actually, and monarchs are especially adapted so that they can tolerate the toxicity of the milkweed plant. The yellow, white, and black coloring on the caterpillars is actually a warning sign for predators to not eat them, as they are toxic themselves and don't taste very good. So after 4 or 5 generations of monarchs, the last generation is the only one that makes the migration from Cape Breton all the way down to Mexico's Oyamel fir forests to overwinter. So now that I've shared some information about pollinating insects, let's talk a little bit more about some of the plants that they love. So as I just mentioned, monarchs have this special relationship with milkweed. Adult monarchs lay their eggs on milkweed, and that's what the caterpillars eat so that they can grow up big and strong and super toxic. Common milkweed, which you can see on the left here, and swamp milkweed on the right are the 2 species that we find in Cape Breton and throughout the province, really. And those are some species that monarchs really love. So common milkweed looks a little bit different. It has this much broader, rounder leaves with light pink flowers, and swamp milkweed, on the other hand, has these very slender leaves, kind of very pointed at the end, with flowers in clusters, like that. So now let's talk about some of the plants that bumblebees love. As I said before, bumblebees are generalists, so they're going to eat, just about any kind of flower that they can get their little hands on. And what they eat really depends on the season. Different plants bloom at different times of year, of course. So what bumblebees are foraging on in June is going to look really different from what they're foraging on in September, for example. And this is why it's so important that when we are gardening with pollinators in mind, that we have things blooming throughout June to October so that there's constantly food available for them. So in spring, for example, usually around June, low bush blueberries here on the left, they're in bloom, and bees absolutely love them. I always find that it's really fun watching them balancing on these plants because the flowers are so tiny compared to the size of a bumblebee, but they make it work. And this time of year as well, lots of fruit trees are also in bloom, like apples or wild cherries. And bumblebees really, they just love to eat the nectar and pollen from those plants. And in doing so, they're pollinating a lot of the crops that are super important for farmers locally. In July, fireweed is a fan favorite among bumblebees. So lots of pinks are blooming this time of year. Wild roses is another good one that bumblebees just love. In late August and leading into September, we have many different species of goldenrods, like this Canada goldenrod here, which is another favorite of bumblebees. And then lastly, when the weather starts to cool down in the fall, less food is available for bees. But this time of year, there's still plenty of asters, like this New York aster. Cold hardy plants like this are really vital for bees when the weather starts to change and food becomes less and less available. So now, as you may have noticed on my last slide, I chose 4 different flowers of different colors to highlight. Research has shown that these are some of the colors that bees are most drawn to throughout the year. And here are a list of some species of flowers that you'll find locally that pollinating insects adore. I'll leave it up there if anyone wants to take a photo. But of course, as Cass said at the beginning, there's going to be a recording, so you're welcome to go back and take a look at these too. But for whites, we have species like meadowsweet, red osea dogwood, pearly everlasting, serviceberries. Pinks, we have mallow, sheep's laurel, lots of different roses, and of course, milkweed. And then for our yellows, we've got St. John's wort, evening primrose, black-eyed Susans, and of course, all of the goldenrods. Bees just love those. And then for our purples, we have species like tufted vetch, bull thistle, chicory, black knapweed, and all of the asters. So now that we've talked a little bit about pollinating insects and the flowers that they like, how is ACAP helping pollinating insects? Well, we recently received funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada from their Habitat Stewardship Program for Species at Risk to help protect at-risk and endangered pollinators in Unama'ki, including the big three that I just mentioned. And there are two parts to this project. So the first involves monitoring and researching at-risk pollinator species, and then the second part involves spreading awareness about pollinator protection and conservation. So for the research and monitoring component of our Habitat Stewardship project, we're doing two different monitoring programs in collaboration with other researchers across Cape Breton, including the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, Eskasoni Fish and Wildlife Commission, and Cape Breton University. So the first monitoring program that we're doing is on bumblebees. I don't really have time to go into all of the specific details about our monitoring protocols today, but feel free to ask me some questions at the end or send me an email if you're interested in learning more. But essentially, the ACAP team and other project collaborators will be monitoring field sites across the island to learn more about bumblebee populations, specifically what species we're finding, where we're finding them, and what flowers they like best throughout the season. So in practice, this really means just walking around a field site, catching bees in a net, and identifying what species they are and what flower they're found foraging on. So our monarch monitoring program looks a little bit different. So like our bee research, we'll be visiting field sites across the island where monarchs and milkweed have been found to learn more about monarch larvae and adults. Instead of catching monarchs, however, we're going to be simply observing them to learn more about where they are found, what species of milkweed they prefer, what flowers the adult monarchs prefer, and what their preferred habitat is overall. So as I mentioned earlier, spreading awareness about pollinators is one of the pillars of this project. In order to do that, ACAP has partnered with the Island Food Network to connect with farmers across Cape Breton. So this spring, we're hosting 3 pollinator workshops at different host farms around the island to talk about how farmers can work alongside pollinators to maximize their crop yields. And we're also offering home visits for farmers that are interested in having us come to their property and help them identify some pollinators that are found on their farms and define some specific ways that they can make their farm more pollinator friendly. Some of the knowledge that we hope to pollinate, so to say, that revolves around the sheer variety of pollinators that you might find on your farm or in your garden. So like this little solitary bee that we have down here in the corner, actually. We also hope to shed some light on how honeybees can be harmful to native pollinators if they're not managed properly. And of course, we're keen to share more information and knowledge about pesticide use. In the most cases, protecting pollinators from pesticides can be as simple as just timing your spraying for outside of crop blooming periods and for in the evenings when pollinators are not active. These are just a few things that we hope to share with farmers and gardeners, but of course, we're super eager to learn from them as well, since they get to work alongside these wonderful insects every day. So to wrap up our presentation today, I wanted to share 10 potential action items that you can take away if you want to help pollinators in your own backyard. So starting up in the top here at number 1, for most citizens, the best thing that you can do is absolutely nothing. Great, so easy. So by not mowing or tilling or raking leaves, you are preserving vital habitat for pollinators. Something that I often suggest is that you can kind of create a lawn of wildflowers and mow paths throughout it so that you still have that little bit of structure to your yard or your field, but you're also leaving lots of habitat for pollinators. And then all of the time that you would have spent mowing, you can spend that time pulling out invasive species if you can. So the next 3 items here on our list are all about making your own pollinator garden. So if you have space in your backyard to have a little garden, it's important to layer it with native plant species that bloom at different times throughout the season, with some more structural pieces like shrubs that can form a little hedgerow or more of an established habitat for pollinators to nest in. A lot of bees, as I said, they nest in the cavities of trees or in decomposing logs, or they burrow nests in the ground. So if you have, say, a down tree on your property from a hurricane or from a winter storm, you can tuck that into your new pollinator garden, add a little bit of sand to your soil, and voila, you have the perfect piece of real estate for bumblebees. If gardening isn't exactly your thing, that's totally okay. You can just leave a section of your yard be, and nature will do the rest for you and create a pollinator garden for free. Another thing you can do, if you like taking photos and if you like the science side of things, you can help pollinators by photographing them. You can share your photos with ACAP by email, or you can upload your observations to citizen science platforms like iNaturalist or Bumblebee Watch. If you're taking photos about pollinators, it's handy to learn more about them. There are lots of great pollinator identification guides out there, and iNaturalist is a great way to learn about bees while gathering data on the go. I'll share a few resources you can check out if you'd like to learn more at the end of the presentation, and Megan's going to share some links in the chat as well that you can check out. So the next 3 ways that you can help pollinators are mostly relevant for farmers. Sometimes large industrial farms will purchase bumblebees or honeybees, and they'll release them on their property to pollinate their crops instead of using wild native bees. And these bees are often neglected, not properly managed, not all the time, but sometimes. But if they are neglected, that can lead to them spreading wild diseases to wild native bees, which is super dangerous for our species at risk. As I mentioned earlier, pesticide use can be incredibly harmful for pollinators as well. So we're encouraging farmers and gardeners to, maybe if they can't cut it out, just to reevaluate their pesticide usage and identify some natural options for protecting their crops. Now, of course, sometimes it isn't an option. So therefore, another way that you can help pollinators is simply by timing your pesticide usage for when pollinators are not active. So in the evening, or when plants are not in bloom. And then the last way you can help pollinators is for all the honey lovers out there. As I mentioned, honeybees can be very harmful for wild native pollinators. So if you like honey on your toast or in your tea, it's really crucial that you buy it from small-scale local beekeepers who help support and protect wild native bees. So to wrap up our presentation today, pollinating insects are incredibly important because they help promote biodiversity and they provide us with the food that we love and need to survive. ACAP is really excited to be working alongside partners like the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources and Eskasoni Fish and Wildlife Commission to learn more about at-risk monarchs and bumblebee species in Cape Breton. I hope that you've learned a few things about pollinating insects today, including a few ways that you can help them in your everyday lives. So thank you so much to NSEN for hosting this webinar and for inviting us to present some of our work on pollinators to all of you. And thank you all for tuning in to learn more about these wonderful insects that make the world go round. So I've included a few QR codes on the screen here. Just as some additional resources that you might be interested in. And yeah, like I said, Meg is going to pop these in the chat. So the first is Bumble Bees of Unama'ki, which is an online book that I wrote in 2020 all about bumblebees in Cape Breton, how to identify them, some information about their life cycle, all that sort of fun stuff. If you're interested in being involved in some of ACAP's citizen science pollinator work, you can join some of our iNaturalist projects and upload observations of plants and pollinators there. And then next we have ACAP's website, where you can learn more about the other cool work that we do. And then the last QR code that I'll share with you is our newsletter, which you can sign up for if you're interested in learning more about what ACAP is up to, including events and volunteering opportunities. And I think that's it for me. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Anna and Megan, for such an interesting and informative presentation. I certainly learned a lot, and I know that everybody else must have too. We will open it up for a Q&A period now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or enter the question into the chat. I do see we have a question already. It might have been answered already, but RJ is wondering, are you using crowdsourcing to monitor the pollinators? So I think that would apply to the iNaturalist platform, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Most of the data that we're collecting, we're collaborating with UINR and EFWC, so the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources and Eskasoni Fish and Wildlife Commission to do most of the more intensive monitoring across the island. So we've each kind of selected field sites across Cape Breton, really. So we're doing that, but we are absolutely crowdsourcing any citizen science data collections as well on iNaturalist. So definitely sign up for those iNat projects if you like that kind of stuff, and upload the photos that you have of bumblebees and monarchs and milkweed too. We would love to see those.
Thanks, Hannah. We also have another comment from John in the chat. He says, I have a few points to mention that you may wish to add to. The first is that I think feral honeybees should be euthanized as they spread disease and compete with native bees.
Yeah, that's something that we have not been discussing directly, but I definitely, yeah, it's definitely an issue. And it's really sad to see any, non-native bee that's kind of, used in an agricultural scape and then just released kind of sucks. Yeah, so I feel you.
He also made a second point is that one hive of honeybees needs about 1 hectare of habitat to provide food, so it makes sense to pressure beekeepers into creating habitat.
Definitely. And it's a mutually beneficial thing too. If you have great habitat, like for, your honeybees, that's also just an awesome benefit for wild native bees too. So the more habitat that you can kind of help support for bees all around, it's just a win-win situation. But those are some really great points.
Thanks, Hannah. Does anybody else have a question? Feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat. I was keeping track of some questions throughout the presentation, but it was so informative that I think you answered them all by the time we got to.
Thanks, Cass. Well, as well, if anyone has any questions or would like to get involved, feel free to reach out via email. Yeah, I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
You mentioned that a lot of wasp species are pollinators. I'm not familiar with different wasp species, but like, is the common hornet a pollinator? I remember hearing that it isn't, but maybe I.
Ooh, yeah, not necessarily all species, just some. That's definitely less my area of expertise. Most of my expertises revolve around bumblebees for sure. But there has been research on many different species of insects. Beetles is another really big one, and flies. It's just kind of surprising when you think about it, because bumblebees are, of course, kind of the number one pollinator out there. But for example, goldenrod is mostly pollinated by beetles, which is really interesting. So there's so much, and it's really challenging actually to study and learn about all of these different insects because they're so small and so numerous. So it's really fascinating.
Thanks. You gave a fantastic presentation, by the way. I was really well done.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I see a hand up from Melinda.
Hi, everyone. So I was involved with the David Suzuki project over during COVID and stuff for to help the pollinators, and I received a lot of like wildflower mixes to plant. And because I live in such a rural area, like I'm not in a city, there's a lot of wildflowers all around me, and I found that I was just planting a patch of clovers around an existing already patch of clovers, and there's already tons of goldenrod that come out in the fall here. So it was kind of pointless for me to plant those wildflowers in this small community where I live in Gaisborough County, where there's a lot of green space. And so I guess now I'm switching back to buying like flowers you would plant, like blooming flowers that are also good for pollinators, like maybe bees balm and things like that, because it was just kind of, I don't know, I feel like the David Suzuki project was geared towards more urban settings, like the Toronto area
Yeah.
where there is no green space. So it didn't really fit small town Nova Scotia. So if you have any advice,
Yeah, those are some great points, Melinda. Yeah, and we have to especially be careful with those wildflower mixes too, because sometimes, if they're being pulled together in other parts of the country, we might accidentally bring in native wildflowers that are maybe native to British Columbia or elsewhere in Canada, but aren't native here. So I think you bring up some really great points about that. A lot of that is really geared towards folks who live in an urban setting, and we're really lucky in Nova Scotia because a lot of us do live in more rural settings where a lot of these seed banks for native plant species are still there. They're under the dirt. They're there, and we just kind of have to let them grow up. Of course, there are going to be some invasive species that'll trickle in. And the interesting thing about that is that for a lot of bumblebees, anyways, they will eat anything, like I said. So they'll actually forage on invasive species, like dandelion, like tufted vetch, all of that sort of stuff, just as much as they'll forage on anything else. Mind you, of course, native plant species are likely still going to be a better food source than anything that is non-native or introduced. But yeah, those are some great points. We recently attended a workshop here in Sydney, Nova Scotia, actually hosted by the Zucchini Wives, which is a local flower farm, and they did a seed swap actually, and a lot of folks brought in some wild native seeds that they harvested, which is really wonderful. So things like Pearly Everlasting, some aster seeds, all of that stuff. So if you're interested in sourcing native seeds, it can be hard. But there are organizations out there. I know of Annapolis Seed is one, and if anyone else knows of some other good ones locally, please throw them in the chat because I'm sure lots of us are interested in sourcing some good seeds to plant in our gardens and in our farms. Yeah, but thank you, Melinda. That was great.
We have another question in the chat. He's wondering, how are the numbers of bumblebees doing? Some up, some down.
Yes, good question. So the yellow band bumblebee, which is a species at risk, that is actually on the rise, which is really exciting. So our friends at the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources have been doing this monitoring for the last couple years now. They actually had really high numbers of the yellow-banded bumblebee, which was wonderful. Last year in general wasn't really the best year for bumblebees. The weather was just so finicky, but we're really hoping that this year is going to be even better. It's hard to tell with hurricanes, especially kind of throwing things off track and those, late frosts. But things are hopeful. We're really, really hopeful that we might get to see a gypsy cuckoo bumblebee yet. I mean, the likelihood is still kind of low since we haven't seen one in over 20 years, but we're still hopeful. They're just a little bit more elusive. So, yeah, great question.
Another question, any comments about competition between farmed bumblebees and native bumblebees?
Ooh, that is a very large question and a very good one. I like that. Yeah, competition is a thing that is really difficult to research with pollinating insects. Some research does suggest that it can be a threat to native pollinator species, especially if there's a lot of, bees that are introduced to farms. But the main issue is not even necessarily competition, it is the diseases if they're not managed properly. But yeah, absolutely. Great question.
And we've got one more in the chat. So Jack says, great talk. I work in the landscaping industry, and while there is an ecological gardening movement, still have a long way to go. What would you say the biggest thing to do to increase awareness of habitat loss and degradation, within reason of the current state of business? Our practices, as we have a big impact in shaping urban habitat.
Oh, that is such a great comment, Jack. Ooh, I think it's challenging because it's challenging in general to sort native plant species. And I think one of the things that that our project is actually looking at is kind of connecting with garden centers to help find ways to encourage garden centers to provide more native plant species so it's easier for landscapers and also just your general, backyard gardener to find these native plant species and plant them more accessibly. But definitely some things that I would recommend is, trying some patches where you're not mowing, see what grows up. Maybe you're going to get some introduced grass species, maybe you're going to get some invasive species, but you just got to try, honestly, in some patches. Leaving as much land as you can undisturbed, that's always going to be better for pollinators. Another tip that I didn't mention that might actually be relevant for landscapers or anyone who mows, if you do like to mow, that's okay. Everyone has their preferences, but a really good thing that you can do for insects in general is to leave your lawnmower blade at the highest level. So 6, I think, is usually that. So that's going to kind of, you're still going to disturb the land a little bit, but instead you're going to make sure that there's a little bit more space between you and any insects, especially if they're burrowing under the ground. It's just going to protect them a little more. So that might be another good tip that you could implement, Jack. Yeah, thanks for your question. It's a tough world out there for urban bees, for sure. Some of our research sites are actually in urban settings, so we're really excited to see what the populations are looking like for urban pollinators.
Thanks, Hannah. Does anybody else have any questions? Jack says, great advice.
Thanks, Jack. No problem.
Just to give folks another moment if they have any final thoughts, I can ask a question on behalf of the caucus. So is there anything else that we can do to support ACAP's pollinator project? Would contributing to the citizen science platforms be the main way, or is there anything else that we can do to support you guys?
Yeah, that is a great way. Another great way is just spreading awareness about the general tips that people can do in their day-to-day lives. I think we're just kind of hoping to share some easy, accessible ways that folks can make a difference for pollinating insects. But learning more about where they are and even what flowers they're foraging on is super helpful for research. Because if we know what types of flowers that bumblebees like, or different species of butterflies like monarchs, then we can plant them and make sure that they're welcome in our gardens or on our farms. Yeah.
Thanks.
No, thank you.
Well, if nobody else has any questions, I just want to thank you again, Hannah, and thank you, Megan, and to ACAP Cape Breton for being here tonight and offering such an interesting presentation. And also a big thank you to everybody who attended. I do want to mention that we have a regular caucus meeting coming up on May 15th from 2 to 3 p.m. So if you're interested in learning more about the caucus and biodiversity issues in Nova Scotia, please feel free to drop in and join us. As I mentioned at the beginning, a recording will be emailed to everybody who registered if you'd like to rewatch or revisit any part of Hannah's presentation. As I mentioned earlier tonight, the webinar is part of the Biodiversity Caucus's webinar series. So once we finish our call, a short form should open automatically in your browser that has the same questions as the caucus interest form that I linked in the chat earlier. So please take a couple of moments after the call to complete the form if you are interested in receiving more information about the Biodiversity Caucus. And yeah, thanks again, everybody, and have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for hosting, Cass.
Thank you.